Hi everyone, welcome to the Mummy Movie Podcast, where we are looking at Day of the Mummy from 2014. So, this film's kind of main star is Danny Glover, best known for the Lethal Weapon series, and the entire film was shot in just 10 days. I will admit, I do get a little bit worried when I see stats like this, largely because I find films that take such approaches are normally a bit hit and miss. So, well, hopefully I'm wrong. We'll see, I guess. In terms of the format for the episode, just for any new listeners out there, we shall start by having a look at the historical aspect of the film, mainly using it as a bit of a jumping off point to talk about interesting points in ancient Egypt. And then I shall review the film and rate it out of 10. But before we delve into our analysis, it is time for my dramatic intro. Right. You are an infamous and controversial Egyptologist. Many have accused you of theft of antiquities, but none have been able to prove it. Until now. You are approached by Kyle, a man with deep pockets and mountains of influence. He uses the information he has on you as blackmail, forcing you to travel to a remote and dangerous tomb in order to uncover the fabled Codex Stone. However, little do you realise that soon Kyle will be the least of your problems. In the tomb, you will suffer a far greater danger. You are about to experience the Day of the Mummy. Okay, we've now arrived at the historical accuracy section. So here, I shall go over the film, saying what it gets right and wrong, but more importantly, I'll be using it as a bit of a jumping off point to talk about interesting facets of Egyptology. There are two main Egyptian characters in this film. The first of these is called Neferu and is claimed to be an ancient Egyptian pharaoh, and the second is his brother, Siptah. First things first, there were no pharaohs in ancient Egypt called Neferu, and in fact, although Neferu is an ancient Egyptian name, it's actually feminine. I have a feeling they were actually trying to refer to Sneferu in the film, as he was indeed an ancient Egyptian king. One really interesting thing about Sneferu is that without him, the Great Pyramid of Khufu would likely have never been built. In fact, without Sneferu, it's very likely we wouldn't have the typical Egyptian pyramid, the type that everyone thinks about when they think of ancient Egypt, at all. To explain why, basically put, Sneferu was the first king of the 4th dynasty, and he's actually credited with commissioning the first ever, quote-unquote, true pyramid. I say quote-unquote because there had been pyramids before Sneferu, but they looked very different to the typical type that you're probably thinking of right now. So for instance, the first pyramid was commissioned by King Djoser during the 3rd dynasty. This was called the Step Pyramid and looked a little bit like a giant stair set. To explain why it looked like this, we need to look at earlier rulers of Egypt. So basically, before Djoser, it was very common for the kings of Egypt to be buried in mastaba tombs. These were essentially a subterranean tomb with a large mud brick superstructure over the top of them. The architect of Djoser's tomb, Imhotep, placed several mastabas on top of one another, gradually getting smaller in size, thus giving the first pyramid the kind of stair-set look I spoke about a second ago. And, well, for a while, the Step Pyramid seems to have been the main influence for other pyramids of the 3rd dynasty. However, when Sneferu came to the throne, he actually built at least 3 pyramids, and there does seem to be some clear indications that there was a lot of trial and error here as he was trying to create something a little bit different. The first of these was the Median Pyramid, though this may have also been linked to his predecessor, King Huni. Either way, the initial building of the Median Pyramid is very similar to other step pyramids, it's built, with steps going upwards. However, there's evidence for kind of later additions. So for instance, later on, another step was added to the pyramid, and also limestone casing was added to the outside to give the pyramid a kind of like smooth appearance, so more like the traditional kind of pyramid we'd think of today. It's possible that King Huni may have commissioned the actual pyramid itself, and then Snefru may have made the later additions. After this, Snefru commissioned what would become known as the bent pyramid. This also had smooth sides, and it was built to be this way right from the very beginning, so it was never intended to be a step pyramid. However, there's a reason it's called the bent pyramid. Basically, the angle was too steep when they were building it, and about halfway up there's a clear bend in the pyramid as the builders had to kind of like change the angle in order to keep the pyramid's kind of structural integrity. Then Snefru commissioned one final pyramid, the Red Pyramid, and this is the first true pyramid of Egypt, the first fully sort of like smooth-sided one that looks like a traditional pyramid. Now, obviously we can't be absolutely certain why Snefru changed the appearance of the pyramid, why he made them smooth-sided, but it is possible that he made these changes due to, well, essentially changing beliefs in Egypt. After all, the smooth sides of the pyramid were not the only changes that were made. So, for instance, if you remember I said that the mastaba tombs from before the time of the pyramids were subterranean. They were a tomb underground with a mud brick superstructure over the top of them. This tradition actually carried through into the step pyramids of the Third Dynasty as well. Normally it's a case of the tomb was built underneath the pyramid and then the pyramid was a superstructure over the top of it. When the true pyramid started to come around, the actual burial chamber moved to inside the pyramid in an elevated position, and it was believed that this was done to help the deceased king to ascend to the realm of the gods. On top of this, traditionally before the Fourth Dynasty, royal complexes tended to have a kind of north-south orientation. What I mean by this is that, okay, so you've got the king's tomb. It was typical for other kind of tombs to be buried in a close vicinity to the king's tomb. And you also had things like the mortuary cult and things like that. And these were kind of positioned, all of them together were positioned in a north-south kind of orientation. So the entire funeral complex, not just the pyramid. However, from the Fourth Dynasty onwards, this orientation moved to east-west, with the actual funeral cult itself moving to the east side of the funeral complex. It's believed that this was done to imitate the daily course of Ra, the sun god, during his journey across the sky. As well, as I say a lot during this podcast, it was believed that the sun god Ra would be born each morning in the east, grow older as he travelled across the sky, and then die and sink into the west. It was then believed that he would travel through the underworld where he'd face various challenges and get regenerated, and then he would be reborn again in the east in a kind of like eternal cycle. As well as this, around this time it was believed that the king would accompany the sun god on this journey. So essentially, the funeral cult being on the east side of the temple complex was so they could observe the sun rising in the morning and being reborn. Therefore, we are left with very little doubt that by the beginning of the Fourth Dynasty, when Snefru was reigning, Ra, the sun god, was already considered a kind of like supreme god, if you will. Like, he was a very popular god. He most certainly would have had a lot of associations with, the king of Egypt. And it's likely that this is what led to the changes in the pyramid. But either way, as I've kind of said a few times throughout this, I do think it is important to realise that without Snefru, we probably wouldn't have a lot of people flocking to Egypt to see the Great Pyramid of Khufu. Without Snefru, we wouldn't have one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the only one left standing. And for that matter, we wouldn't have very likely any of the smooth-sided pyramids. It's quite funny, actually. I remember a while ago seeing a kind of like conspiracy theory YouTube video about the bent pyramid, where they were trying to claim that it was built that way deliberately. And I don't normally get annoyed by these videos, but the person in it said that he found it very disrespectful that Egyptologists think that it was, a mistake that it was built that way, because it implies that the ancient Egyptians didn't know how to build pyramids. But in all honesty, I think it's kind of the opposite. These are the prototypes that lead up to the true pyramid shape. And if anything, it's not disrespectful to say they made mistakes along the way. It's a compliment because they persevered, they pushed through, and they created these marvellous buildings, these marvellous tombs. What's actually ridiculous to say here is that there would have been no trial and error whatsoever. Of course there would. The Egyptians were human just like us. We make mistakes, they made mistakes. It's just that simple. Anyway, getting off topic, the point is that the king the film is trying to refer to here is very likely supposed to be Sneferu, but they've just pronounced his name wrong and called him Neferu. Though, I guess by the same token, pretty much every aspect outside of this doesn't resemble Sneferu in the slightest, so who knows, maybe they did just chuck out a random Egyptian-y sounding name. I guess that's equally possible. As for the other mummy in the film, Siptah, it is quite ironic that they claim he is not a pharaoh when there actually was a pharaoh by the name of Siptah. It is fair to say that his rule was incredibly short, seemingly only lasting 6 years, but he was the son of Seti II and one of his Canaanite consorts, and was the penultimate ruler of the 19th dynasty. It is worth noting, however, that in the film, Sneferu and Siptah are supposed to be brothers. I'm sure you'll be really, really shocked to know that this is purely fictional. In fact, shockingly, Sneferu never even had a brother called Siptah. Siptah never had a brother called Sneferu. And in fact, if these are the two men that the film is trying to refer to, they lived about 1,400 years apart, so there is a little bit of an issue there. Anyway, moving on. When they arrive in the actual tomb, Jack, the main character, finds several hieroglyphs. He claims that they are in a dialect he has not seen before. Then, after a short struggle, he begins to translate them. I'm sure it's not going to be a shock to anyone that his translations here are complete nonsense. Also, the hieroglyphs shown are clearly Middle Egyptian in origin, the most common type of hieroglyphic writing in ancient Egypt. In fact, when it comes to learning hieroglyphs, most universities will first teach Middle Egyptian, and then give students the opportunity to branch out into either Old Egyptian or Late Egyptian. So the fact that this dialect is completely alien to Jack to begin with is pretty weird to say the least. On top of that, most of the hieroglyphs he is trying to translate are pretty standard offering formula. So, offering formulas are almost certainly the most standardized text in ancient Egypt. Basically, they were designed to sustain the deceased in the next life via the promise of offerings. So usually it was a case of the deceased family speaking their name as, well, essentially it was believed that a person's name kept their very essence alive, and then they would read aloud the offering formula. In the case of the film, it looks like the inscription is just offering beer and bread, from what I can see at least, but often offering formulas would include beer, bread, ox, alabaster, fowl, and linen. They were like the most common things that would be offered to the deceased. It is worth noting that although sometimes these offerings would be given as well, it wasn't a necessity. Very often just the verbal offering in itself would be enough. Either way, it was believed that this offering would kind of manifest in the afterlife. When it comes to the inscriptions in the film, one part that really made me laugh is when basically Jack, he claims he found an engraved inscription written by the slaves that built the tomb, and that they'd written about a secret way out that they sort of made so they could escape. Firstly, the tomb probably wouldn't have been built by slaves. There's actually plenty of evidence out there that points to the builders of the tombs of Egypt as being, well, incredibly talented individuals, very talented artisans and builders. The most famous example of this would be Deir el-Medina from the New Kingdom. They were the builders of the Theban necropolis, so the tombs of the nobles, the Valley of the Queens, the Valley of the Kings, that kind of thing. In fact, talking about Siptah earlier, they would have built his tomb. But even when it comes to the Old Kingdom, so when Sneferu was ruling, we have evidence for workman villages then as well, and even papyri for, say, like the Great Pyramid of Khufu. And even outside of that, we have graffiti from the actual workers themselves, which clearly shows that they weren't slaves. They were an organised workforce that was split into two groups and were well-fed and well-paid, essentially. So regardless of if we're talking about the Old Kingdom or the New Kingdom, like about 1,500 years later, there is no evidence that the tombs of the pharaohs were built by slaves. But even taking that out of consideration, secondly, why on earth would slaves leave an engraving like this? If they were able to write at all, which, let's face it, they probably wouldn't have been able to, they would have written it, on papyrus, not engraved it into a wall. Also, at another point, Jack claims that he's found the Arabic name for talisman written on one of the inscriptions. And the great thing is, he says this in a way as if it's not surprising at all. And I'm sure this is going to absolutely shock you, but the ancient Egyptians did not speak Arabic. In fact, ancient Egypt had been going on for about 2,000 years or so before Arabic even has its origins. Don't get me wrong, I get that these films aren't supposed to be accurate, but there is a point where I feel it's just insulting people's sort of intelligence at some point, and this is definitely one of them for me at least. Therefore, it's fair to say that this film doesn't do a great job when it comes to history. Shocking, I know. On the plus side, the names it uses are Egyptian, though Neferu is more of a feminine name, and I strongly suspect they meant Sneferu, unless of course they just picked a random name, which is also fully possible. On the downside, outside of the completely incorrect translations, we also have Jack claiming he found Arabic on an ancient Egyptian inscription, and the idea that slaves apparently sneakily made engravings that told them the way out of the tomb. An idea which is weird, to say the least. Okay, we have now arrived at the review section. So here, I shall simply talk about what I liked and disliked in the film, and then rate it out of 10. First things first, although maybe not a huge positive, I felt that the plot here was at least serviceable. As I explained in my dramatic intro, you have Kyle, played by Danny Glover, who wants to possess a fabled Egyptian artifact named the Codex Stone, which is basically a really large diamond that's placed in the heart cavity of one of the mummies. It was basically placed there to ensure that he would remain alive and not reach the afterlife. As such, Carl blackmails Jack Wells into finding the stone for him. This is a pretty simple but effective enough plot, I feel. Not necessarily original, but I wouldn't say it was bad either. Further, I felt they had a decent idea with the shooting of the actual film here, as well. Basically, Kyle gives Jack a pair of glasses that Kyle himself can also see through, through like a camera in the lens. It is through these glasses that we see the majority of the film, and he also gives Jack an earpiece so he can speak to him. In all honesty, I felt that this approach was pretty mixed in terms of its results, as I will go into later, but at least it was a film trying something a little bit different, so you do need to give it some kudos for that. A little like a found footage film, if you will. Also, Carl talking to Jack as the film goes on almost gives it a kind of like video game-esque feel. It reminded me a little bit of Metal Gear Solid. I was half expecting him to yell, "Snake! Snake! Snake!" at one part as Jack dies or something like that. I feel some of my audience will get that. Others definitely won't. On top of that, I actually quite like the approach to the mummies in the film. They were a little bit CGI-ish in fairness, but the camera didn't focus on them too much, so although it was noticeable, it wasn't too jarring either. In my opinion, this is actually how CGI should be used, kind of, infrequently and subtly. Further, the enemies are done in a way where they are quite quick and sort of skulk in the shadows, so there's a genuine sort of feeling of threat here as well. Also, With Jack, the main character, although I will go into his, actual personality a little later, there is at least some character progression here. He starts off pretty self-serving, very much the kind of person who would let people die if it benefited him. He is also something of a womanizer and steals artifacts, so genuinely not a very nice person. However, towards the end of the film, he does go out of his way to not only keep the members of the team safe, but he risks his own life to save others when he could have easily escaped. I really like this as, on a personal level, I do think that it's important to realise that, people can change. I feel someone has to do something incredibly bad not to be given that chance, and this theme is shown quite well at the end of the film here. On top of that, it did lead to Jack's character ending up being a little bit more rounded in the long run. However, despite this, and I suppose a little bit contradictory as well to it, I still didn't particularly like Jack as a character, and I did feel this development in his personality came far too late in the film. Basically, the first time we see him, we find out he's a thief, so immediately I don't like him. His next bit of character development is that he's a womanizer and views women as prizes rather than people. His own words, not mine. So my dislike for him increases. He then kills some people without any remorse whatsoever, so he's now a thief, a womanizer, and a murderer. And, that's just the tip of the iceberg. There is more here. I mean, don't get me wrong, I still like that his character changed and grew for the better. But ultimately, this transition came far too late in the film. It wasn't enough to redeem him. In general, outside of Jack, none of the characters in the film seem to have much personality at all, to be honest. You have Cooper, who, I suppose he's quite confrontational. He basically calls Jack out on his checkered past, and the film kind of makes out that he's in the wrong for doing that. If I'm honest, I also wouldn't want to work with Jack. I feel I've made that quite clear. But I guess by the same token, you are supposed to keep a certain level of professionalism, and he's clearly not. So, yeah, sure, I guess. He's not really going about things in the correct way. There are also two other men on the team who are just kind of there, to be honest. I wouldn't even be able to tell you their names, really. And then you have Kate, whose whole personality is just to essentially be a woman and to be the love interest. And even when it comes to the love story between Jack and Kate, it makes absolutely no sense. Jack shows himself to be this horrible individual, and then Kate just kind of sleeps with him. I will admit, I am personally terrible at spotting flirting. I tend to think people are just being nice most of the time, but I'm pretty damn certain there was no chemistry or hint of attraction on Kate's side before that scene. Although, I will admit that the sex scene here did make me laugh a lot. Basically, Jack puts the glasses to the side, the ones that Danny Glover can sort of see through. And then Danny Glover just kind of appears in the side of the screen and watches. At one point, you just have Danny Glover going, she's something else, Jack. She's something else. It's so incredibly weird. I don't think I was finding it funny for the right reasons. In fact, I know that, but it was just so strange, and it was impossible not to laugh at, to be honest. Speaking of the glasses, as I said earlier, most of the film is shot through a camera on, Jack's glasses, and this is a cool idea. It reminded me a bit of the pyramid, and I've just had a thought. So the pyramid also came out in 2014. I'd almost accused Day of the Mummy of stealing the idea, but I'm 95% certain the pyramid came out after this, as I'm pretty certain it had a December release date. Either way, anyway, back to the film. Either way, it was a cool idea for the film, but I will admit, for the most part, I'm not actually a fan of this kind of filming. Don't get me wrong, there are a few films out there that work for it. I do quite like, for instance, some of the Paranormal Activity films, and, well, obviously the Blair Witch Project is a lot of fun. But overall, I do find this style of film makes me feel a little bit sick. Not like massively, but, just a little bit. I guess this is a personal preference, but, well, hey, this is my review. In this regard, however, for the most part, this film was designed to be very kind of like dark and claustrophobic. And I did also find that the kind of found footage approach here did lead to confusion at times, as it was kind of hard to see what was going on. One final point, I'm not going to say that this is a negative necessarily, though it definitely did take me out of the film a little bit. When they finally arrive at the burial chamber, there are lit candles around the room, everywhere. None of the characters acknowledge this in any way. This tomb was supposed to be abandoned for thousands of years. Also, the candles are clearly modern, so I'm guessing the mummy must have, popped down to Asda or Walmart in order to pick them up. You can just almost imagine him, waiting in line, just counting his change. Let's face it, he's a mummy, he's not going to have a credit card. Or change now, I think about it. The ancient Egyptians didn't have money. They tended to, trade using other items. You could just imagine him, standing in line with a big bag of grain or maybe some copper or something. Anyway, overall, there are a few positives here. The film has at least tried to approach its story in a different way. The mummies do genuinely seem dangerous, and although the plot is, hardly outstanding, it is at least serviceable. However, on the downside, most of the characters here are very unlikable, and although our main character does show some positive character progression at the end of the film, it is very much a case of too little, too late. Further, although I can appreciate that the film has tried something a little bit different with its shooting style, it was also a little bit jarring to watch, and mixed with the dark, claustrophobic atmosphere, this did make it quite hard to follow. For this film, I am giving it a 4 out of 10. Thank you very much for listening. I certainly hope you enjoyed the episode. And if you have, why not like the episode, leave a comment, subscribe? If you are a bus driver, instead of putting on the radio, why not just play episodes of the Mummy Movie Podcast instead for the entire bus to hear? Kind of like a forced audio cinema type thing, I guess, if you will. Forced audio cinema sounds a little bit like an indie band. I'm not going to lie, I think it does anyway. Either way, I probably should stress, please don't force people to listen to my podcast. Maybe that's not the best example. Instead, maybe, I don't know, if you're a poet or a performer, why not do a dramatic reading of one of my episodes? Maybe that might be more appropriate. And I give you full permission to do that, by the way. And join me next time, where we shall be moving away from our familiar format. Once again, I shall be joined by guest Jake Fleming. He last appeared on the show when we looked at Manos, the Hands of Fate, and before then for Troll 2. This time, we shall be looking at Godzilla vs. Megalon from 1973. And if you want to know why I've picked that film, just look up Godzilla Dropkick on YouTube. Honestly, one of the greatest scenes ever recorded. It's so unbelievably stupid and I love it. Anyway, I hope you all have a fantastic week, and see you then.